Tonight we're going to talk about the Great Depression. And I'm one of those who views the Great Depression not as one big 12 or even 16-year lump of economic activity, but rather I think of it as having some fairly distinct phases. So I'm going to present this tonight to you in terms of the 4 phases of the Great Depression. And I want to start by pointing out to you that this was not the first depression in American economic history. We'd had a number of them before. The first cyclical depression in American history occurred after the War of 1812 and 1819. The next one happened in 1836 after the Second Bank of the United States was killed by President Andrew Jackson. A lot of its inflationary malinvestments were liquidated in the Panic and Depression of 1836. And on and on. There were several others leading up to the big one that began in 1929. But this one stands out in history by a number of important measures. Needless to say, it probably has had more impact on American psyche and American policy in the decades since than any other depression had on our thinking and subsequent policies. But more importantly, it lasted at least 4 times longer than any previous depression in American history. At least 4 times longer. All the others were over with in a year or 2 or 3, maybe 3.5 or 4 at the most. This one lasts at least 12 years, and if you consider some very important observations by economist Robert Higgs, suggesting that really the war years were not a time of recovery, certainly not for the consumer, you can add another 4 years and talk of this as probably a 16-year trough in the economy. And that makes it more than 4 times longer than any that came before. In fact, there is a little-known depression that happened just shortly before, within the same decade of the one that we'll talk about tonight. That was in 1921, a very short but very sharp depression after several years of inflation of money and credit to help accommodate the expenses for World War I. That was the last depression in which the government responded by pretty much doing what it ought to do, which is backing off, reducing its burdens on the economy, trying to balance the budget, reducing tax rates, allowing a wounded economy to heal. But we forgot that one for the most part, or we have forgotten it because it was so brief. The one that begins in 1929 goes at least to 1941, and by some measures perhaps another 4 years. That cries out for an explanation. What caused it and what made it last so long? That's what I hope to answer for you tonight. The first phase of the Great Depression we call the phase of the monetary, the primary phase, or the monetary or financial phase of the Depression. We could spend an evening, we could spend a whole course talking about booms and busts and where they come from. I have to radically condense that tonight, and I'll do so by suggesting to you that if you ever want to know where this roller coaster economy comes from, look at monetary policy, because it looks like a roller coaster. Erratic policies of the monetary authorities that first produce or stimulate an artificial boom by driving interest rates down through a creation of money and credit, stimulating a boom in the economy which is not sustainable. At some point, they reverse policy for any number of reasons. The house of cards collapses, and you have the depression phase of this cycle, stimulated first by monetary policy. That's Austrian economic trade cycle theory condensed into a couple minutes. If you apply that to the 1920s and ask yourself, well, before the collapse in 1929, did we have an inflation of money and credit? It's not very hard to find it. Murray Rothbard in America's Great Depression talks about an expansion of money and credit that might have been as much as 66% from about 1924 to late 1928. There's dispute over what's the best measurement, how extensive was the expansion of money and credit, but it was substantial. Interest rates were driven to very low levels. Some people will say, yeah, but if you look at prices in the 1920s, consumer prices, you find not much movement at all. This was a decade of relatively stable prices. So where's the inflation? But of course, those of us of the Austrian persuasion do not define inflation as rising prices. We define inflation as an increase in the quantity of money and credit, with rising prices being one of the effects of that. If you look at monetary policy, you find an extraordinarily accommodationist policy in the 1920s, from 24 to late 28, perhaps in part to accommodate a return by Great Britain to a gold standard. And normally that might be something to applaud, but Britain wanted to do it at a rate that did not accurately reflect the inflation it had conducted during the World War I, and to assist Britain to restore gold convertibility at an unrealistic rate, the Federal Reserve apparently made some agreements to weaken the dollar so as to help the British pound. That may have been one of probably multiple motivations for Fed policy, but it was extraordinarily expansionist. If you look at those consumer prices, yeah, you might say, well, it didn't show up there. But there are a number of things to consider when you look at those. One is you had some very substantial and very helpful tax rate reductions early in the decade and in the middle part of the decade, in the years that Secretary Andrew Mellon was Treasury Secretary. He's my favorite Treasury Secretary, by the way. A good friend, Bert Folsom, who wrote The Myth of the Robber Barons, figured out that if you look at the number of employees in the Treasury Department after the, I think, 11 or 12 years that Andrew Mellon was Treasury Secretary, it works out to he let go, on the average, about one Treasury Department employee for every day of the 11 plus years he headed the Treasury Department. He was the prime architect of the very substantial tax reductions in the 20s that brought the top rate down from in the 70s to about 24, 25%. And that stimulated a real boom in investment and productivity. And we had a cascade of goods pouring forth, an increase in productivity, which surely moderated what might have otherwise been a much more noticeable rise in prices. But if you look at certain prices, you can find there were some very substantial hikes in the 20s, reflecting this easy money policy. You had a land boom in Florida. Does that sound familiar? With prices in Florida soaring. You had stock prices, of course, reaching dizzy heights. So much of the newly created money perhaps found its way there. In any event, we had in the so-called roaring 20s a booming economy, at least in part fostered by an inflation of money and credit. But by late 1928, it became apparent to those who were looking at the right numbers that the Federal Reserve started to shift its policy away from a very accommodationist, expansionary, inflationary policy to much more tight monetary and credit policy. In fact, what begins by late 28, early 29, will be by 3 years later about a 1/3 contraction in the nation's money supply. And of course, there's a lot of discussion or debate among economists. Did the Fed really set out to accomplish that? Probably not. It certainly got out of control at some point. I don't think they engineered it with that in mind, of reducing the money supply by 1/3, but that's exactly what happened. So you have this roller coaster monetary policy, boom, followed by contraction. And you shouldn't be surprised that the economy roughly mirrors what was happening there in monetary policy. Some people will look at the events of October 24, 1929 in particular, and say, well, that's what caused the Depression. The stock market collapsed. Black Thursday, and then Black Monday, and Black Tuesday. You had black every day of the week before it's all over. And some people will say, that's what caused the Depression. The stock market fell apart, collapsed, and then dragged the rest of the economy down with it. But that ignores, I think, the much more fundamental trends taking place, this dramatic shift in monetary policy that not everybody saw, certainly not at first. The smart money, like the Bernard Baruchs and the Joseph P. Kennedys, they saw this shift. They realized, I think by late 28, early 29, that change was in the air. And certainly by the summer of 29, the smart money begins selling stock, and I think that's why the stock market actually peaked out a couple months before the big collapse in August of 29. The pressure of the selling of the smart money that watches things like monetary policy and trade patterns and actions of Congress and so forth causes the market to top out and begin to decline, and it's not until the masses of people sense change in the air and stampede and dump their stocks in late October that you have this very notable historic crash. If nothing else had happened, I think the chances might have been good that 1930 at some point might have been a year of stability, if not recovery. And this might have gone down in history as another episode of inflation of money and credit stimulating a boom, and then there's a correction, then the economy sloughs off the excesses and things move forward again. But something did happen in 1930 to take a very bad situation and make it far, far worse.